Achieving a gorgeous grin from home isn't a total mystery with Bite Clear aligners. Just don't be surprised if all of your sleuthing friends start asking, "What's your secret?" Begin by ordering your at-home impression kit today for only $14.95. Bite Clear aligners are doctor-directed and delivered to your door. Treatment costs thousands less than braces. Plus, they offer flexible financing, accept eligible insurance, and you can pay with your HSA FSA. Get 80% off your impression kit when you use code WONDERY at Byte.com. That's BYTE.com. Start your confidence journey today with Byte.
Acast powers the world's best podcasts. Here's a show that we recommend.
What is The Briefing Room? It's a behind-the-scenes look at how the criminal justice system works and the lives of the people within that system.
If you love true crime, well, these are the real people who do the job every day of making sure justice is served.
Hi, I'm Detective Dave.
I'm Detective Dan. Together we have decades of experience in local law enforcement, a profession that we think is often misunderstood.
So we're going to explore how to do it right, and we won't shy away from when it's done wrong. These are stories you'll hear nowhere else. Unique, frank, and unvarnished.
From the team that brought you Small Town Dicks, this is The Briefing Room. Episode 1 drops on August 30th.
We'll meet you in the briefing room.
Acast helps creators launch, grow, and monetize their podcasts everywhere. Acast.com.
Hey listeners, before we get into this week's episode, we wanted to put up some content and trigger warnings. Because we are talking about Pulp Fiction, we inevitably discuss the quote-unquote gimp scene and the sexual assault that follows. If you want to skip past this part, we'll put the timestamps in the show notes so you know where to skip. And as always, thanks for listening, but if you do need to sit this one out, we completely understand. Thanks. And welcome back to Scarred for Life, the podcast where we open up old wounds by looking back at the films that scared us as kids. I'm Terry.
And I'm Mary Beth.
In each episode, our special guest brings with them a movie that traumatized them as a child.
This week, our guest is director, editor, and cinematographer Devereux Milburn. His trippy, fun, gross, and all-out hellscape feature film debut, Honeydew, is out now on streaming platforms. Welcome to the show.
Hey guys, happy to be here.
We're
Yay.
really excited to talk with you, but I think first, before we do ask questions, Mary Beth has a specific question.
Oh, what is the deal with your photo on IMDb?
Yeah,
every time I clicked on it, I was like, am I in the right place?
I've had two other people mention that on a couple different outlets, and so I don't have any professional photos of myself. And I was hoping that 2020 would bring more step and repeats that I could sort of plug in the IMDb profile photo, but it didn't, and I didn't have anyone take my picture at all, other than probably my wife and my mom and maybe a couple friends. So I can't remember what I had there before, but it was also odd. So I just swapped out whatever I had there with like an old elementary school picture day photo.
I love it because I've always wondered if you have like control over the pictures that go up there, because like I think about this recently where I went to go look at Alexander Skarsgård's picture and he's like in a tux and briefs and that's about it. And so I'm always curious like how those photos end up there.
Yeah. They I guess they have to approve everything, and they, for whatever reason, they were okay with that. But yeah, I haven't gone through the professional photo gamut yet. So
I like it a lot. I had to ask about it. It made me laugh.
It's the topic of conversation at the very least.
There you go. Good icebreaker.
Good icebreaker.
Right?
Exactly.
Damn it, jinx, Terry. Ew.
Yep. So let's bring it back to that young Devereux. How did you get introduced to horror?
Oh man, so yeah, I've been thinking a bit more about the sort of genesis of my horror life. And as a very young kid, I sort of had to sneak peeks at horror films and rated R and PG-13 films up until I was probably 11 or 12. You know, it'd be like sleepovers at friends' houses and or maybe the odd unrated film that my parents weren't really privy to the whatever the parental advisories were at the time. And so, I mean, I first remember looking at the back covers of The Shining and The Exorcist and whatever my mom or dad had lying around in the basement, and The Silence of the Lambs was a big one. And I just remember being sort of captivated by whatever stills they had on the back and just wondering what was happening before or after that still.
Yeah.
And just really becoming sort of obsessed with the sort of the phantom image, I guess.
Yeah.
And that sort of carried on until I was probably like 7 or 8 or 9. I was able to gradually sneak into movie theaters or my friends, you know, broadened my mind with what else was out there, which was obviously a lot. But yeah, I feel like the first horror film I ever saw, or the first one that had an impact that I watched over and over again, was Haunted, which I don't know how well known it is. It's a Lewis Gilbert film. He did Whatever Happened to Baby Jane. And it's with Aidan Quinn and Kate Beckinsale, like very, very early Kate Beckinsale. And it just terrified me. It's essentially about a guy who goes to this huge mansion, English countryside, to ultimately disprove a case of ghosts, and he winds up being disproved himself.
I have seen this cover before. I've never seen this movie, but I just went to go look it up, and I remember seeing that cover in rental stores and everything.
Yeah.
Is it haunted?
It's called Haunted, yes.
Okay.
So it's very easy
95.
from 95. It's very easy to mix up with like The Haunting and The Haunting of Hill House. Or like there's so many movies with haunted in the title. But that's the first one I sort of remember being obsessed with. And then from there it was The Shining and The Exorcist, like I mentioned before. And Audrey Rose, the Robert Wise film, was also a big one. And that's when my dad introduced me to when I was probably like 10 or 11. And yeah, I'd always, from a young age, like I said, before I was even able to sort of watch full films, I was intrigued by violence and violence and horror and anything sort of in or around that genre and subgenres. And I think partly it was because I wasn't, you know, a lot of my friends were allowed to watch those films at a younger age and I wasn't. So I sort of developed a fascination with it.
I mean, you mentioned kind of initially being maybe attracted to the violence or the gore and that kind of stuff. Did you get scared watching horror movies as a kid?
I did. I mean, Haunted and like The Omen and The Haunting. The Haunting was also a big one. Those terrified me. And I think, you know, when you're a kid, a lot of the stuff that terrified me about them wasn't necessarily the violence itself. It was the tension before the violence and the sort of knowing that it was coming and just sort of being enveloped by this world, you know, this group of people created. Oftentimes it was, you know, you start out in a very normal world and a normal family and a normal town. And it was a lot of it for me was the implications of what was to come. And then, you know, I always go back to The Shining when I talk about that sort of just even with the opening credits and that chopper shot of the car winding around the mountain.
The dread from that. Yeah.
Yeah. And that classic score was just, I just had this sort of belly reaction to it. And that's what I always wanted to be able to emulate before the really sort of blood spatter gore and jump scares came into effect with me. Yeah. So yeah, it was definitely, it terrified me without a doubt. I mean, I think the earliest film that terrified me was probably like Wizard of Oz when I was 4 or 5. But that's obviously far from outside the genre. But
that movie scared a lot of kids. It's that sort of like surrealness that I think, especially if you're watching it at a certain age, it's just like really works as far as like fear goes, honestly.
Yeah. No, it does definitely. It definitely tugs at those strings. The sort of the Wicked Witch of the West, the Flying Monkeys, the the whole sort of intro of those characters is.
I still have the image, and I haven't seen Wizard of Oz in forever, but I still have the image of the legs sort of retreating under the house after it's like fallen on the witch. Like that is an indelible image that is stuck in my brain since I saw it as a kid.
Yeah, the striped stockings,
just sort of rolling up.
Exactly. Yeah, those were the things for me that like I just, it's the details, to use a snotty word, the mise en scène and the production design, and those are the things when you're a kid that you remember what they're wearing, like a really thick wool sweater or red shoes, or they have some sort of odd haircut. Those were the things for me that like really made me feel unsafe. It didn't make me sort of grip my chair and run out of the room, but it made me feel a type of way.
Yeah.
And I remember seeing Independence Day. I can't remember if 94 came out when I was like, it must have been probably 11 or 12. I can't remember. It was like 97, 98.
Yeah, 96 actually.
96?
Yeah.
So yeah, I think I was 11 or 12 when they're dissecting the alien or whatever the actor's name who plays Data in Star Trek is sort of the mad scientist behind the whole Area 51. He winds in the alien suddenly comes to life. They think he's dead, and uses the actor as his mouthpiece to sort of communicate through the bulletproof glass. And I remember that's the first like jump scare I remember really having an effect. I'm sure there were others before that, but yeah, the biggest thing for me even now is the implication of terror. Changeling was one I saw a bit earlier on.
Oh, the Changeling is so good.
Yeah, and that was just absolutely terrifying. I mean, anything.
The bathtub.
The bathtub scene and seeing the face underwater, anything that involved a large house. I just always felt so unsafe and exposed for whoever the protagonist was, and the feeling of possibility. Like if the more rooms there are and the more space there is, the more walls there are to hide behind.
Yeah. So do you still get scared as an adult watching horror films?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, typically either. I mean, in the theater it has obviously more of an effect sonically, but if I'm watching a horror film at home alone in the dark, I might as well be 8 years old.
I love that.
Yeah. No, it's still, I mean, that's why that's the main reason I watch new horror films. And it's definitely still, I'm still, even if I know the man or woman there's a man or woman behind the curtain.
Yeah.
It doesn't sort of alleviate that sense of doom and dread.
Do you remember the last movie that scared you that you've seen recently?
Ooh, that is a good and tough question.
Not to just put you on the spot.
Yeah, no. The last movie that scared me recently, I was just watching something. I feel bad because I was watching it on my iPad under my covers. I watch a movie every night before I go to bed. Under the covers? So I watch because my wife falls asleep. I usually fall asleep around 2 a.m.
Very good.
And so I sort of have my own little home theater under the covers.
Oh.
And, I know it sounds silly saying it out loud.
No, I love it.
It's amazing. I love it.
I don't know that it was a film. I want to say it was what was the Ben Mendelsohn show on HBO? I think it was HBO.
Oh, The Outsider?
The Outsider.
Yeah.
I think that was the last thing that really, I can't remember what episode it was. I think it was one of either the first or second episode where the guy is called to that sort of farm or vacant area, and it's before he's sort of assaulted, so to speak. That's the last thing that like leaps to mind.
I mean, that's a good one. That was actually a pretty gnarly. There's a lot of really gnarly moments in that show.
Definitely. I guess another one. It was supposed to be at Tribeca with Honeydew. It's called My Heart Can't Beat Unless You Tell It To.
Oh yeah, I saw this at one of the festivals recently.
Yeah, it's by Jonathan Cordes, and it was not heavy on the jump scares. It was definitely more of a slow burn, but there was a sense of darkness that was so controlled and consistent throughout the film that made me feel creeped out. And I don't always get that. It was definitely, there's a really sort of considered tone and aesthetic that really enjoyed and admired.
Awesome. Transitioning into Honeydew, can you tell our listeners what your movie's about, for those that might not know?
Sure, yeah, of course. It's many might not know. It's about a couple who embarks on a camping trip. It's actually a guy named Sam who's sort of following his girlfriend on this research trip. She's studying to get her PhD in botany, and they wind up setting up camp on a farmland that's owned by someone who isn't interested in them essentially camping there, and lets it be known and sends them packing to essentially try to start their car, and it doesn't start. And there's a series of sort of familiar tropes that lead them to the house of this kindly retired farmer named Karen, who takes them in very willingly and excitedly and promises to call them a jump and gives them dinner and introduces them to her sort of odd nonverbal son. And all the while, Sam is very willing and excited to sort of accept her hospitality, and Riley is ever resistant. The night wears on. This sort of sense of warmth and hospitality that Karen puts forth at the outset starts to fade a bit and is replaced by what seems to be ulterior motives.
Speaking of Karen, what a fantastic performance by Barbara Kingsley.
Yeah. Oh my God.
What was it like? What was that casting process like to get her and also Steven Spielberg's son in his first role?
Yeah, it was. We essentially, I always mix up who came first, but I know that Barbara was a bit further down the line in terms of casting and who we sort of locked in before production.
Mm-hmm.
We had been looking for someone before we saw her. I think we'd been looking for Karen for about at least a month,
mm-hmm.
and been pretty, actively casting every week, at least a couple times a week. And I had actually gotten her contact through a friend of a friend, someone actually that my mom knew from college, who was pretty active with Barbara in the theater scene in Minneapolis at the Guthrie, and just sort of sang her praises and did some research on her. And she just has been a really prolific stage actress for the last 45 years, maybe more. Or had been at the time. And she came in, and within the first few minutes, we just knew, after she read the first couple lines of the sides, we all sort of looked at each other and knew that this is our Karen. She just had a physicality and a malleability that we hadn't seen in auditioning for Karen before her, and I hadn't really seen ever. And she was just able to find that character really quickly. Obviously, after we cast her, we had a bit more time to sort of dive into backstory and do some rehearsal, though we actually didn't have that much time to rehearse with the whole cast before we went into production. But she was just, she was like a lightning rod. And what she can do with her face and her body and her limbs and timing, it was just, it was really exciting to watch her get into that. And with Sawyer, that was another one that I had connected to through a friend of a friend. Sort of, I got on the phone with him, and I'd seen a taping that he'd sent me, or the friend had sent me, and I really liked it, and I can't even remember what it was for. And I'd also seen he was in a short film called Afterlight. It was like a Vimeo staff pick, and I really sort of I just liked his look, and I liked his cadence, and just sort of, he seemed like he could work really well for Sam. And at that point, he had mostly just been doing theater for a while. And he came in for an audition, and we had just cast Malin as Riley, and he read with her, and they just had this instant chemistry.
He brings such a nervous energy to the film that his tics where his leg is popping, jumping up and down from nervous energy, and he's biting at his thumb. I do that all the time. And so I found myself mimicking what is going on screen, because you talked about, you brought this up when you were talking about The Shining earlier, but the kind of dread that opening scene infuses. This movie is full of that anxious energy that sort of, something is coming, And so you're so anxious about it because you're just waiting to see when the trap is going to spring, that I found myself literally biting at my nails through most of the first act or so, I would say.
Yeah. There's definitely a lot of me in my nervous habits in Sam. And some of those, so there's a number of things that he does throughout the film, especially the first half of the film, that, I sort of injected into his character and into his physicality. And he sort of really got into that. I mean, even between takes and when we weren't even filming, he was gnawing on his hand in some way and or jiggling his leg, and sort of it really dove into that state of mind, because he's not, I don't think, an overly, I mean, I know has his neuroses, and we've talked a lot about that, but I don't know that he's as physically nervous as I am, especially like when I'm, trying to moderate something like food or sugar or whatever. I resort to, the next available thing, which is typically my own digits.
Yep.
I think for Sam that he's just in this point in his life where he is just incredibly uncomfortable and wants to feel good.
Yeah.
And every, the person that he happens to be with at that time he's on this trip with is very much interested in him staying healthy and being active and living a long life. And he sort of sees that as inhibiting his level of pleasure and indulgence. And Sawyer is so good at sort of wrapping his arms around that and also doing it in a really sort of funny but subtle and nuanced way.
So before we go into the movie that we're going to talk about, we have one more question. So what inspired this like oddly specific topic? Because as you watch the film, like it gets pretty specific. So I'm curious about what the inspiration was behind the idea.
I'd been working on a feature adaptation of a George Saunders short story called The 400-Pound CEO for, at the time, it was probably about a year and a half or so. And this is in late 2017. And my friend Dan Kennedy, who shot the film as a co-producer, essentially texted me and asked me, do you want to shoot a horror feature next month? And I had been sort of feeling really discouraged about the fact that I hadn't really directed anything in over a year, and feeling anxious about, sort of getting the muscle working again. And it was taking a while for this other thing to get off the ground. And I said, yeah, let's do it. And obviously 1 month became something like 9 or 10 months and became a bit bigger scale than what we had initially envisioned. And he sent me an outline, at the beginnings of an outline, which sort of centered around a couple on a camping trip. And it was actually a couple who was being terrorized by a sort of woodland creature.
Ooh.
And it started out as a bit more of a creature film. And then gradually we sort of pivoted a bit, and it became something a little deeper, a little more twisted. And the idea for Sortico being a sort of a through line came out of an article that someone sent me. A friend who knew that I was writing a horror film and sort of saw some article, I can't remember what magazine it was, but they sent me an article about a tiny village in France in the 1950s called Saint-Pont-Esprit, which I always butcher that name. And essentially, large portion of the citizens in the town became infected by a fungus called ergot, which is there was a more commonly found.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, in the Middle Ages, but also in
St. Anthony's Fire, I think, right?
St. Anthony's Fire, yeah. And this was in the 1950s, and I was sort of, the first time I read the article, I don't think I noticed the sort of when it actually happened. And then I looked back and saw that it wasn't necessarily that long ago. And there were hundreds of people developing gangrene and hallucinating and being committed to sanitariums. And I was just really struck by what a cool element that could be to add as a through line and use to connect them to the land and connect them to Karen. At the time, there wasn't a Karen yet, but connect them to someone who lived on the land and who was sort of a seemingly, salvation for them when they have no resources and are looking for shelter. And I also injected some of the themes that I was working on this other script, which deals a lot with body image and weight control and feeling like you're sort of, there's no room for you in the world you're in. And so that was sort of the genesis of the sortico element, and the religious element followed suit, because there was a lot of, any time that there's been a case of ergotism, which is ergot infection, especially in the Middle Ages or hundreds of years ago, there's been speculation that there was some sort of, it's sort of a punishment from God, or that there's, it's a tribulation for sins. If there's a blight in any way, even if it's not ergot, there's always certain people who think that it's some sort of reckoning. And so yeah, that's a bit of the story of how that got infused.
So we've talked about Honeydew, but Devereux, what other movie are we discussing today?
We're talking about Pulp Fiction.
Pulp Fiction, the Quentin Tarantino classic. Everyone who went to film school or studied film has seen this movie and knows about it, and probably had a poster of it on their wall, myself included.
Yes, for sure. Yeah.
So for those of you who haven't seen it, Vincent Vega, played by John Travolta, and Joel Zwinefeld, played by Samuel L. Jackson, are hitmen with a penchant for philosophical discussions. And this well, that's funny. Their storyline is interwoven with those of their boss gangster, Marcellus Wallace, his actress wife, Mia, struggling boxer, Butch Coolidge, master fixer, Winston Wolfe, and a nervous pair of armed robbers, Pumpkin and Honey Bunny.
Yeah, that's it.
That's it. That's the one. Yeah, that's a good log line. I feel like I've read parts of that before, and the philosophical, the penchant for philosophical conversations I remember seeing and being like, I never imagined if I were to write like a log line or a summary of the film. It's interesting that I feel like that was Tarantino's main focus, was this sort of ongoing dialogue between them.
Yeah. So Devereux, tell us about why you picked this movie and like when you first saw it, and tell us your horror story about Pulp Fiction. Yeah,
initially I was a little hesitant to pick this one because it's not an all-out horror film. It obviously plays with genre, and it's also, a lot of people have seen the film and have a relationship with it. And so I didn't want to be too on the nose with, sort of recounting my experience watching it for the first time. But, I think I was 8 years old when I first saw it.
Oh, wow.
My cousin, who was 4 years older than I was, he was about 12 or 13 at the time, was allowed to watch anything from the time he was born, and was always playing graphic films, watching graphic films, or had them on in the background. And I was always sort of eagerly, sort of willing viewer. And I remember he was playing this for me, and I remember thinking, I think the first time I watched it, I started it from the Royale dialogue in the car.
And you know what they call a quarter pounder with cheese in Paris?
They don't call it a quarter pounder with cheese?
Oh man, they got the metric system. They wouldn't know what the fuck a quarter pounder is.
And what do they call it?
They call it Royale with cheese.
Royale with cheese.
That's right.
Between Vincent and Joel, and I remember it just feeling like I must be watching this sort of out of context, or I must be deep into the film at this point, because it was sort of obviously started to jump around and was the most nonlinear thing I'd ever seen. Obviously, I was only 8 years old, so I hadn't seen much nonlinear storytelling at that point. I think I started it there, and then I think we got through to the scene where ultimately they enter the apartment of these young guys, and Samuel L. Jackson's character Joel starts to sort of go about intimidating them in this really sort of passive way. And I think then my cousin rewound it to the first scene with Pumpkin and Honey Bunny, and I just, that first freeze frame of Amanda Plummer, when they're having this really casual conversation, and they decide to rob this diner, that was just shocking, because I'd also never seen anything where a scene could take that drastic of a turn.
Yes, I'm glad you brought this up because I really wanted to talk about this scene in particular, because where Amanda Plummer's character is being very nice and she's like, you know, talking, oh, I don't want to kill anyone and all that kind of stuff. And then on like an instant, she's like, any of you fucking pricks move, I'm going to execute every fucking last one of you. Like it's such an escalation.
Yeah.
But it's like the most beautiful line delivery when she jumps on the table and like does that. It's just like that line, remember, it's just so good. Yeah.
And the way that obviously her dialogue sort of goes into voiceover for those last few syllables after the freeze frame, and you just sort of see that look on her face. And yeah, with the moments earlier, she was like sort of smiling up at the waitress when she was pouring her coffee, and that was jarring. That was just, I mean, there's no one's been shot. There's no real blood or overt violence yet. And then the opening titles start with the Miserlou track, and you know that surf rock. I'd never heard anything like that before, obviously, and it was just such a shock to the system. And it goes into that sort of spaghetti western titling, and I was just hooked and so disturbed already. and then I was reintroduced to Vincent Vega and Joel, and I got through that scene where he recites the Bible verse, and everything starts so sort of benign and not harmless, but there's definitely a calm.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
A lot of that first act for Butch's story, and then ultimately you're sort of expecting that something's amiss. And then when the blood is shown, the first time that there's violence, there's something about those hot lights and their outfits and the Jerry curl and Vincent Vega's hair, the way that they're talking. It was so, I mean, I hadn't seen films like that, or any film that he, like Kiss Me Deadly or any Aldrich film or any of the stuff that he might have referenced and sort of implanted into present time. It was also really jarring and so foreign and scary to me, and just it made me, for whatever reason, feel really uneasy. And yeah, when he first shoots the guy after reciting that verse, it was just like, that was sort of when I realized, oh, this will be like the first, you know, really violent, sort of terrifying movie I see, because anything before that might have been scary in its own right, but it didn't really. The trigger wasn't pulled, so to speak.
Yeah.
And then I think that just being introduced to characters who talked normal, had these normal conversations throughout the film, and had these really normal interactions, and there was romance between me and Vincent Vega, and there's a lighthearted sort of theme throughout the entire thing, and even to the end when Pumpkin and Honey Bunny are talking to each other all lovey-dovey, and even the scene with Butch when Butch is introduced and he's having the conversation with Marcellus. Up until that point, you know, there does seem to be like there is access to safety, I feel like. Or at least I felt like at the time, even though there's this big shootout in the apartment. and then, you know, we don't see Butch kill the guy in the boxing ring.
Right. It's just referenced.
It's just referenced through the radio and the cabbie, and that was all fairly benign for me. And I think I recognized Bruce Willis at the time as being in Die Hard, and I hadn't seen Die Hard, but I think I'd recognized him from the poster or something.
Well, he's kind of like the all-American hero at this point, right? Like he spends the 80s with that sort of like Die Hard, you know, attitude. And so seeing him in this kind of role is really interesting, because I do think that Tarantino kind of leans into that persona, I think, and kind of almost in some ways kind of deconstructs it in a way. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, no, because he goes back to his motel, and he's very lovey-dovey and sweet with his girlfriend, and Lemon Pie. I don't know if that's her character's name, but that's what he calls her.
Every time I think of I think of pancakes. I always think of her wanting to order blueberry pancakes
with maple syrup.
Yeah.
With maple
syrup. Yeah. No, and it does seem like when he gets there, it's like, oh, okay, so that's as much of Butch's killer edge as we're going to see is sort of referenced off screen, and obviously that's not the case, and it's all sort of spurred by the watch drama.
Okay, I want to talk about this watch drama for a moment, though.
Please.
Because I completely forgot about the scene until I rewatched it, and
did you? Oh,
I did.
Boy.
Okay, because I haven't seen this movie in probably, I don't know, a couple, maybe 2 decades.
Oh wow!
Like it's been
right.
it's very. I've only seen it once, and it's been such a very long time since I had seen it. And we'll get to that watch like in a minute. But what surprised me about this is this idea that this watch is sort of like this heirloom, and it kind of reminds me of like this sort of idea of American exceptionalism, where it's like this has been through so many different wars that America's been involved with. Of course, everyone but one person that has owned it has died up until this point. But the fact that this heirloom is then shoved up both Butch's father and this man who he's never met up his ass, and then it's just presented to him as sort of like, here you go, here's your heirloom, just blows my mind.
I just want to give also a shout out to Christopher Walken and his best comedic performance as he talks about the watch in his ass, and it's just like very in his voice, like, this watch, I put it in my ass. Like, it's just
your father'd be damned. I can't finish the rest of that sentence, but
I hid this uncomfortable hunk of metal up my ass 2 years. Then after 7 years, I was sent home to my family, and now, little man, I give the watch to you.
Yeah, no, it's a quintessential Walken performance, and I'm convinced that I don't know what his first SNL performance was. I want to say it was in the 90s. Maybe it was. I mean, he'd obviously been working for a while before then, but I feel like he became a bit of an SNL darling at some point after that. Maybe it was a bit later, but I feel like that is like one of those films where you're like, this guy has to host SNL. And it clearly has chops. Like, he has this timing, and the intonation is just like, and obviously his face and his eyes and just the whole presentation is just priceless.
Oh, it's one of my favorite parts of the movie. Like, it's so brief, but just like, I remember when I was a kid, when I saw this for the first time, because I was like between 10 or 13, and because I was like, haha, butts, I thought this part was so funny, the way he was talking. And he hands him this watch, and I was like, that is so gross. In my like, little kid head, I'm like, hey, you for the rest of your life carry around this hunk of metal that was up 2 people's butts. It's just like it's so immature but it's also really like, the way it's presented is very funny.
It's really funny, yeah. But it's also like, it's this little kid who's hearing this story who, like, you can only imagine like how much of that he's actually absorbing and even understands.
Like sitting in front of the TV, and they're like, Butch, there's someone here to see you, and this like grizzled Warbit just like pops down and starts telling you these stories, and you're like, I just want to watch cartoons. Like, who are you?
Yeah, and it's such a good sort of cut to flashback moment.
Yes.
You know, because there's so much going on, and it's so high stakes. And it's at that point, actually, I mean, he's essentially on the run, but he's sort of put at ease the minute he walks into the room, and his girlfriend is lying on the bed, and they have a really, sort of relaxed back and forth, and they both shower, and then the moment he realizes the watch isn't there, everything starts up again. And it's the last thing that you think would activate the next beat.
Yeah.
Of all the things that are happening, it's the watch that's made everything all the more dangerous and more dire. And then we see that flashback, and it completely takes us out of the moment, but it does it in such an effective and funny way.
And that's something that I recently thought about with Pulp Fiction, is it feels like such small things trigger these really important moments. And I feel like Tarantino is really good at kind of putting this puzzle together in a really fascinating way. And I saw this when I was 10 to 13. like between those ages. It was my dad's favorite movie. He was like, you got to watch it. I did not understand most of it.
Yeah, me neither.
Like, I was like, I have literally no idea what's happening with the gimp scene, and my dad wouldn't explain it to me, which, but I was really, I was really confused about the nonlinear structure. Because like you said, Devereux, I was still learning about movies, and there's that point in the middle where Vincent is shot and then he wasn't the rest of the movie. And I was so confused. And I was just wanted to ask, like, what did you both think of this nonlinear structure? And why do you think Tarantino opted for that with this film?
I certainly, when I had the exact same reaction when I first saw it. And like I said, like I did start it. I remember starting it a little further in than that first diner scene.
Yeah.
But after then we went back and started from the beginning. It still didn't make sense to me.
Right.
Because outside of the fact that there are these sort of fade outs and fade ins to sort of indicate a change in space and time, I was completely lost, and I couldn't figure out why the next scene were with Butch after that shootout in the apartment, and why they're wearing the t-shirt and shorts, and then he's Vincent Vega's killed after the toaster. The fact that the toaster, I actually remember talking to my psychiatrist at the time. I had a therapist. This is getting way too intricate, but my parents had split up, and so they put me in therapy, and I remember talking to her about having watched it. I don't know, it just maybe because I was just so confused by it. And she said, and I remember mentioning that scene where the toaster goes off and he kills Vincent Vega, and then Vincent Vega is all of a sudden still alive, and her trying to break down why I thought that happened. And I had no answer. I mean, what could I say, that he'd come back to life somehow? Or there was some sort of I knew that there was something maybe it had to do with the fact of with whatever was in the suitcase. And so that definitely always stuck with me, and contributed all the more to sort of feeling uneasy about what I was watching and not being able to sort of fit myself into it in a way that when you're that age, or when you're 10 or you're 11, the whole reason you're watching a movie is to follow a story, and essentially, and with the hopes that it ends in a happy ending, which ultimately it kind of does. Though that Vincent Vega has been killed by the end. And I watched an interview with him, with Tarantino. So like an interview from the 90s at some time after it had been released, or the one can. And he said, I'm trying to remember what he said specifically. I mean, he talked about essentially that he thought the story worked better out of time, and that the characters and their journey had more of an effect out of time, and the people that they interacted with on their journey made more sense in the places that they were introduced. And I completely agree with that now. I mean, that would have made no sense to me when I was a kid, but I definitely heard that and thought, well, yeah, it's just such a fresh way to sort of follow someone and their mood. Because their mood is, in some ways, even though it's out of time, even though it's nonlinear, you're still following their sort of experience and their mood in a linear way, inevitably. You're still seeing when, after Vincent Vega's killed, and then the wolf scene follows afterwards.
Boys, get to work. Please would be nice.
Come again?
I said a please would be nice.
Get it straight, Buster. I'm not here to say please. I'm here to tell you what to do. And if self-preservation is an instinct you possess, you better fucking do it, and do it quick. I'm here to help. If my help's not appreciated, lots of luck, gentlemen.
You're still experiencing his sort of world in your own linear way. And it makes sense.
Yeah.
And I know that when I saw that interview with Tarantino, he referenced certain other films that I can't name them off the top of my head that did employ nonlinear storytelling, and I think Hitchcock might have been in there a bit, and Aldrich.
Well, he was sort of the one to kind of bring it to the more 1990s modern mainstream America, because I remember particularly in college when I was reading I was an English major, and so I was reading a lot of texts from places outside of the United States. And there's a lot of, especially over in Asia, there's a lot of nonlinear storytelling, but it's not something that's really caught on here in the States a whole lot. But then when he brings this, when I saw this for the first time, this was the first time I'd ever experienced a story told out of order. And it also broke my mind I think I was 18 when I saw it for the first time.
Yeah.
And it broke my mind too, because I was like, wait, how is he still alive? Because for some reason I was not grasping initially that it was told out of order. And so,
Right.
So the fact that Tarantino is able to bring this to a modern American audience and then has created like a legacy of films since then that have played with time a lot more, I think is really interesting.
Yeah. No, I completely agree. And yeah, I mean, I can say, again, it's easy to say that, yeah, from my perspective, he was the first, at least for me, that introduced that way of telling a story through cinema, because it's my first experience with it. It is interesting that it hasn't quite caught on, or it does still happen. I mean, I think, I'm trying to think of another American film. There's plenty. I guess Memento's one.
Have you seen Go?
Say it again, sorry, bro.
The movie Go from 1999.
Yes, but I haven't seen with Katie Holmes and Mark Wahlberg. Is Katie Holmes in that? No,
Katie
Mark
Holmes
Wahlberg
is in it. Timothy Oliphant is in it.
Timothy Oliphant, right?
Yeah,
I haven't seen that since I was a kid too. Actually, I think the last time I saw it was a Blockbuster rental. But yeah, or Amores Perros is Mexican, but that was probably the second one that I'd seen that was told a bit out of order or in fragments. But yeah, no, it's. I mean, I still attribute, and again, going back to the gimp scene.
Okay, yes, let's talk about the gimp scene.
Let's talk about that.
Obviously, yeah, that's something I remember. Part of the reason that was so terrifying, not the main reason, obviously, but part of it was that Marcellus is put in a situation where he has no power. He's been completely reduced to essentially the victim and someone who's just stripped of all of their powers and all of their intimidating qualities. And we start out with him being, the guy who's essentially driving this bus, driving us through this narrative. To see someone like that who's got such force be put in that situation and then be introduced to that type of violence when you're a kid. And then, Zed takes him in the room. And when I first saw it, I actually didn't know what he was doing. And I can't remember if my cousin was in the room when I saw that scene, but I know that I remember watching it and knowing, like, I thought he was hitting him. It was some sort of blunt force abuse, but right. I knew that the fact that he closed the door meant something. There was something deeper and more twisted going on. And I remember the visual that I remember being the most terrifying for me was the ball gags. And it was the first time I'd see these big bright red ball gags and the sweat and the sort of the harsh lighting. I just remember that being so terrifying. And I knew that those meant something. Like I knew that I don't know that I knew that it was sexual, but I knew that they weren't like rags or like, socks or bandanas. Like there was something perverse about them. And I remember that striking me more than the sort of off-screen stuff that was going on. But yeah, that for me, I remember, and then I think that my dad had a roommate he was living with who explained it to me.
Oh, jeez.
Graciously explained it. He was like, how about that rape scene? And I said,
wow.
What rape scene? And he said, well, that's what's happening. I said, I think you're wrong. I said, I think he was just like hitting him really hard. And he said, no, I'm sorry. And I think while he was explaining it, he realized, oh shit, I shouldn't be having this conversation with that probably was 9 by that time.
Oh no.
Yeah.
No.
So yeah, that was my first memory of sort of absorbing that scene.
Yeah. So I mean, I was 18 when I saw this film, and I was deeply closeted at the time, and I was watching this in my female friend's basement, and it was just the two of us. And I remember picking this movie because I'd heard, it's hyper violent, and I was thinking it was going to be this exciting, shoot 'em up type movie.
Mm.
And I remember sitting down and watching this and being like, this movie is, I was probably an insufferable teenager, but I remember thinking this movie was really boring because it's just like a lot of conversations.
Right. Yeah.
And I remember thinking, gosh, these people just like to talk and all they do is talk. And then there's all of a sudden this like punctuation of violence, like Marvin getting his face blown off or
Right.
Vincent getting mowed down when the Pop-Tarts pop up.
Yeah.
So I remember thinking that. And then I remember getting to the gimp scene, and again, I was deeply closeted, and I see this very sexual and this very homosexual sexual imagery of this man that has been kept in this cage in like this
Right.
full on leather suit, and he's let out, and then he's hanging from the ceiling. And then the sexual assault happens in the room. And I remember at that time I was I knew that I was gay, but like I was pushing back on it so hard that anytime there was anything that was remotely gay that was on screen, I remember pushing back very hard on it because I didn't want them to think that I was. And so seeing this scene and being forced to watch it, where it's just me and this girl who, looking back on it, she was deeply like in love with me, but like I didn't know it at the time. And so it was like this really awkward. It was so awkward for me. And I think that might be one of the reasons why I've never revisited this movie since I was like 18 years old, because it was, this scene imparted so much like nervous, uncomfortable energy in me, because like I knew that there was something very sexual happening, but I didn't quite understand what it was and how it would have related to me. And so that might be thinking back on it now and talking about it, why I never watched this film until last night. Like literally last night was probably the first time since I was 18. So
holy shit.
That's 20, so crazy.
22 years.
That's crazy. God. Yeah. That definitely makes a lot of sense. I mean, especially, they're introducing it. I mean, it's being introduced essentially as in a violent way, and in a way that's very sort of, debauched and wrong. And it makes sense that if you're not at a point where you're open about that when you're presented with it sort of being, when it's introduced in a very violent and terrifying way and so vividly.
Yeah. Well, I think this is honestly my first experience with like gay sex on screen, and this is what is being introduced to me.
Yeah,
so
me too. Probably the same as me.
And that's sad. Well, not sad, but it's like well, and it's like, this is like, I think this is a really big moment of gay sex on screen. Like it's like Pulp Fiction's so popular, and it's villainizing queer sexuality, and it's like taking kink and rape and like putting them all in one place, and it just seems to be sensationalizing gay identity in a way that is very harmful. But like on the other hand, I think this scene is like my dad was laughing through it, which might have been because he was nervous, and also he's kind of an asshole, but just telling it how it is. I feel like people often laugh at this scene because of the gimp, and people are so uncomfortable, and this is a moment of spectacle, but I also think this is a very rare moment of watching a man be sexually assaulted, and I feel like it's an important conversation to have because it's not had very often. And there is he gets revenge, so there's this interesting like rape revengey angle that could be seen here, but I don't think that's necessarily talked about. It's more just like this big black guy was assaulted by like a gross white dude, and it becomes like guy, this so I don't know, I think there's something interesting
white security
there.
Guard.
There's something interesting there about that.
Definitely. It's
representation.
There's plenty of heterosexual rape before and since, and even now, you don't see a lot of that. And it was, as an 8-year-old, it's confusing.
Yeah.
Partly because, at the time, obviously, I didn't know exactly what was going on, but I knew something. Especially when the gimp comes out, there was an introduction for me, to gay or straight, to any sort of sexual.
It's like deviancy, like
deviancy,
almost
right.
deviant.
That's the word I was looking for. Yeah, and it's a good point you make. Like where they are sort of combining kink and rape in a way that I think over the last few decades we've maybe been able to separate those a bit more effect and use them more separately, and use kink in comedy, but also in a serious way and and not have it be as stigmatizing. But also something that I feel like most people, when they talk about Pulp Fiction, maybe because it's hard to do in a censored way, they don't talk about that scene. Even though it was, I mean, a lot of people, if you're having a conversation with your friends, you do. But, you know, typically when there's a reunion or some sort of like, you know, hearkening back to it as a classic film, that's not touched upon as much.
Well, it's such a weird, I mean, I guess in a movie of like weird non sequiturs, it's such a bizarre moment because I mean, Tarantino has described it also as being like the film goes from being at this point from being like a body and soul type neo-noir boxer movie to where he's like basically walking onto the set of an Urban Deliverance in this scene. And it's only because of like them taking the wrong turn. Like it's only because we've talked about, we brought this up already a couple times where it's like a small insignificant moment causes a change in the plot. And this is another one where they just picked the wrong pawn shop to go into. Like if he had just stopped a building before or gone to the next door, it would have turned out so much different. But it's because he just happened to stumble into this Confederacy flag hillbilly-ish pawn shop that shit goes south again.
Yeah. And in that way, this is true of all of his films, but he's very good at sort of following his pen without shame or like preconceived structural direction. You know, like he doesn't think, oh, will this not make sense or will this sort of throw people off? And that's why he's such a great storyteller and why his films are so beloved is because they constantly surprise you and go, and he's the sort of the master of tangents. You know, he's like, he can bring you somewhere and then that's completely, you know, seemingly unrelated and then take you right back to where you left off and continue to make it really interesting and unpredictable.
So speaking of kind of interesting and unpredictable, what do you guys think is in the suitcase? I mean, I know obviously it's a MacGuffin and Tarantino says it's whatever the audience wants it to be, but
right.
Have you guys ever thought about what could be in there?
I mean, I was told, I don't know that I've thought about it beyond what I was told when I was younger, which is that it's Marcellus's soul that he's delivering to the devil.
Yeah.
And ever since then I've sort of accepted that, or some version of that. I've heard a couple different versions of it, but that was in a way what had happened. And that, for whatever reason, I remember being told or thinking that the Band-Aid on the back of his neck was somehow how they extracted his soul from him.
Yeah. I mean, what about you, Mary Beth?
Yeah, I've also heard lots of stuff about that, about, you know, diamonds from Reservoir Dogs, like all this stuff. But I also think, I also watched it as thinking it's his soul for similar reasons that you said, Devereux, but also in my mind, when they open it in this gold shimmer, like this otherworldly gold, like light takes over Tim Roth's face and the awe on his face.
Open it.
Wait, what is it? What is it?
Is that what I think it is?
Mm-hmm.
It's beautiful.
I feel like maybe, I don't know, in my mind, money or diamonds wouldn't be that entrancing. I feel like there's something
it's
else
so beautiful,
in there that's
he says.
Yeah, it's gorgeous. And he doesn't try to take it out of there. You know what I mean? Like it's something that transcends material stuff.
Right. Yeah.
So,
yeah.
Terry, what about you? What do you think?
Yeah, that's my thought. And the reason why I was thinking about that a whole lot more on this rewatch is this kind of segues into it for me, who you guys think the protagonist is, if there is one in this film, because I think the reason why the film is structured the way it is, I think it's Jules, because he's the one that gets like the sort of character progression where he starts off as this killer. He starts to question himself. He has the moment of divine intervention, he believes, where whether it is or not, because the bullet holes, I believe, are on the wall before he gets shot. Yeah. So like, there's that kind of question of, is this really divine intervention or not? It doesn't really matter. That's a moot point because to him it is. And it's a moment where he like changes his thought. And I think that it's sort of him escaping the devil, for lack of a better word. And that's sort of epitomized in this 666 suitcase that might be holding the soul of the person that's kind of held him simultaneously in his like orbit. And it's because at the very end of the movie that he is able to exit and leave. We know that Vincent's going to die because the story's told out of order. So we know that Vincent is going to his death and Jules is not, because otherwise he would have been there in that same apartment getting shot at by Butch. So we know he escapes, whereas we know that Vincent doubles down and goes back to this life of evil, and that's why he ends up dying. And so it gives it a happy ending because you see Jules leaving. And so for me, it's all kind of tied together of what's in the suitcase, the structure, and also the way the film ends.
Yeah, I definitely felt. Yeah, I've always felt like it was Jules, and even, I mean, obviously he's the most. I don't know that he's the most. Maybe he is the most outspoken. I say the most outspoken maybe because he's the loudest and projects the most. And Vincent Vega sort of presents this very laid back counter character to him, and obviously Butch is pretty low key. But yeah, I've always felt that, and I don't know if it's just because of that last diner scene. But even if he wasn't this very sort of in control, brash, outspoken, fearless, likable, funny guy, and wise guy, I think if you end with a scene like that, and he's clearly at the very least the protagonist of that scene, it's impossible to sort of not feel like it was his story all along.
Yeah.
And also, yeah, you obviously, it's hard because Vincent Vega does get killed halfway in, and then when he is killed, he seems so secondary because we're in Butch's world at that point.
It happens so quickly. You almost miss it. You know what I mean? Like, you're like, who? Because I remember when I first watched it, I was like, wait, who was that? Right. And it does, like, it seems it's so jarring because it's, we've been following him for a while, then all of a sudden just like on the toilet. Right. Bye. Yeah.
He needs to not go to the bathroom. Because like, I mean, he goes to the bathroom when Mia overdoses. He goes to the bathroom and comes out and gets shot. He goes to the bathroom in the final scene when Honey Bunny and Pumpkin are taking over the restaurant. Like, dude needs to maybe not be in the bathroom.
Yeah, he needs to hold it.
Reading his book.
His book,
Modesty Blasé, I think is the name.
Yeah, it was some pulp. It was Pulp Fiction, I think, right?
Yeah.
No, it's a good point.
I do have to add a very funny short anecdote. So the scene where they're dancing at the diner, which is the best. My fiance and I are joking about having that be our first dance at our wedding. Instead of doing like a slow dance, we're just gonna do the dance from Pulp Fiction.
I think that's perfect.
5 straight minutes.
I love that. That's excellent.
I mean, talk about iconic moments, though. Like this movie has them, and that's even if you've never seen the movie. Like I remember my parents doing like that the fingers over the eye, move that Vincent does. Like even if you've not seen that movie, that dance scene. Right.
Yeah. I know it's. I definitely that whole diner sequence where they're ordering the she doesn't order the Amos and Andy. What's the Martin and Lewis milkshake?
Martin Lewis
and
the $5 milkshake.
$5 milkshake.
God, he just
a young Steve Buscemi taking the order.
Buddy Holly, yeah.
Buddy Holly.
And I remember hearing. I will say that's one other thing that stands out to me is when he takes the orders and he says,
"How do you want that cooked? Run to a crisp or bloody as hell?"
I remember thinking how crude that was for a waiter to ask when I was a kid. for a waiter to ask that about how you want your steak, and how that sort of, even though there was fairly lighthearted little sequence when he said that, it sort of brought the violence back to the moment for me. But yeah, that dance scene is just like, can't really think of a more iconic dance scene.
So on that note, do we want to wrap up and give this a rating out of 5, or is there any other points that we want to touch on? There's so much to talk about in this movie. It's almost overwhelming.
It's right. Yeah.
Okay, Terry, how many Royales with cheese out of 5 do you give Pulp Fiction?
Oh, man. I mean, in terms of like iconic films and how important it is to American cinema, I mean, I feel like I have to give it at least 4.5 Royales with cheese. I'll give the half to poor Jules, I guess. But This isn't my favorite of Quentin Tarantino's films, and it might be because of the time that I saw it in the sort of like history that's hung over it. But like, it's not the one that I'm going to probably ever, just bring out and watch, even though I know that for a lot of people, it's like the big Quentin Tarantino film. I'm more of a Kill Bill fan myself, the Volume 1. In particular.
Yeah, for sure.
I understand.
So yeah, I think in terms of its importance in American cinema, its importance to set his career, and it's sort of like legacy leading from there. I do think for me, it probably would give it 4.5 Royales with cheese. What about you, Mary Beth?
I'm going to give it a full 5 Royales with cheese. I have a love-hate relationship with Quentin Tarantino, but as is stereotypical of a lot of film people, he was one of the first big directors I got into. I loved Inglourious Bastards. I loved Pulp Fiction. And so I have a lot of love for this movie and how it introduced me to a lot of cinematic techniques. I know that Quentin Tarantino, as a white guy saying the N-word quite a bit, is pretty gross and not my favorite. But, acknowledging some of those problems, I still love this movie for what it is and how beautiful it is. And its whole package is just absolutely stunning. So that's what I think. All right, Devereux, you have the final word. How many Royales with cheese do you give Pulp Fiction?
Yeah, well, I don't know if this is allowed. I was going to give it 4.75 Royales with cheese. Right. For that very reason. Right. I think a lot of people didn't fully register, especially younger people, the N-word use by white people, especially Quentin Tarantino's, the scene where he really just goes for it.
Oh, I know.
And when it came out, and it really does hit now. It's just like you can't not flinch, and that's definitely something that I think I could live without. But that's I think would be the only real percentage that I would cut from my score.
And Tarantino really hasn't learned that much from it, from that. He continues to do that. I think in Django Unchained.
Yeah, Django Unchained. Well, yeah, geez. Yeah. I think my guess is he's meant to only have one more film in him, but my guess is he'd probably hold off for the final film on using as many derogatory, racial epithets. It's funny how it really almost 20, was it 25 years ago? 27 years ago?
Yeah, it came out in 94, I believe.
Right.
So yeah, it's 20. I was 93.
I'm bad at math.
20,
I am too.
26 or 27.
Yeah, that how there hasn't been much of a reduction in that type of dialogue. But yeah, it is, for me, it was the first really sort of smart and exciting, experience in cinema that I'd ever had. And it introduced me, like you said, to a lot of what you can do with film and where you can take your characters and how you can sort of how flexible film can be, even though there is sort of unlike a lot of other art forms, there is some rigidity with time and pacing, and you have to capture people's attention over the span of 2 to 3 hours. But it sort of was the first thing where I realized you can really sort of go crazy.
Yeah.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Devereux, for joining us to talk about Pulp Fiction. Where can our listeners find you, and what do you have that you'd like to share?
Yeah, so I'm on Instagram and Twitter as @BlindSpotStud, and you can watch Honeydew starting tomorrow in the U.S. on VOD. Pretty much just about anywhere you can rent films online. That includes iTunes, Amazon, Vudu. Most cable on demand providers, and that's April 13th, and it's been available in the UK for a couple weeks now.
Watch it. It's really cool and weird, and it's like Texas Chainsaw Massacre but for 2021 in a cool way. So yeah, watch it.
Exactly. Good pitch. Yeah, I like it.
So listeners, you've heard from us. We want to hear from you. What is your experience with Pulp Fiction? You can send us an email at scarredforlifepodcast@gmail.com, or you can reach out to us directly on Twitter. I am at MB McAndrews.
And I'm at Gailey Dreadful.
And of course, don't forget to follow the podcast at Scarred Podcast.
And don't forget to review, rate, and subscribe.
Thank you to Eric Power for our artwork. Thank you to Sean Keller for our music. Thank you, everyone, for listening. Stay safe out there, but most importantly, stay creepy.
And until next time.
Acast powers the world's best podcasts. Here's a show that we recommend.
What is The Briefing Room?
It's a behind-the-scenes look at how the criminal justice system works and the lives of the people within that system.
If you love true crime, well, these are the real people who do the job every day of making sure justice is served.
Hi, I'm Detective Dave.
I'm Detective Dan. Together, we have decades of experience in local law enforcement, a profession that we think is often misunderstood.
So we're going to explore how to do it right, and we won't shy away from when it's done wrong. These are stories you'll hear nowhere else. Unique, frank, and unvarnished.
From the team that brought you Small Town Dicks, this is The Briefing Room. Episode 1 drops on August 30th. We'll meet you in the briefing room.
Acast helps creators launch, grow, and monetize their podcasts everywhere. Acast.com.